Good afternoon and welcome to our live stream tour of Parliament House. My name is Natalie and I work on education programs at Parliament House, and this is Will. Will is one of the chamber staff within the House of Assembly and he regularly takes public visitors through on tours of Parliament House. Today we are hoping to show you through the building the way that you would ordinarily see it on a public tour to make up for the fact that our building has been temporarily closed for COVID-19 measures. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that Parliament House on North Terrace in Adelaide is on Kaurna land, and I would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as traditional owners of the land on which Parliament House stands. I would also like to acknowledge the fact that Parliament extends beyond the walls of this physical building by the way that our members have representation for the people of South Australia across the whole state. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all land within South Australia. And I will hand it over to Will, who will take us through on our tour today. So thank you very much, Will.
Thanks a lot, Natalie. Okay, let's begin. Follow me. Alright, I'd like to start the tour off with the original concept of the Parliament and what we aspired to build. So the actual Parliament today doesn't have this three-storey tower or the dome, okay, or the triangular portico. Those plans were omitted due to financial constraints, depression, the World War, etc. So instead, the history of it is that the building was built in two parts. So the 1889 part was built in 1/3 here and stopped. That's the House of Assembly side. And it wasn't until 1939 that we actually completed the Centre Hall and the Legislative Council part of our Parliament. Okay, next we'll enter the HA corridor, the House of Assembly corridor. First on our right here we have a bust of the Honourable Don Dunstan. He was Premier in the 1970s and 1979. He was a social reformer here in South Australia, an advocate for multiculturalism and making Adelaide and South Australia in general a more vibrant place to live. Okay, and behind me here on the left is the Right Honourable Charles Cameron Kingston, who was a member of the Queen's Privy Council, and he was Premier in the 1890s. He was responsible for a lot of social reforms here in South Australia, including women's suffrage and the 8-hour working day, and also one of the fathers of Federation. So he was an advocate for South Australia to move from being a colony to a state as part of the Federation of Australia in 1901. Moving along from that bust, we have another one here, Sir Thomas Playford. Okay. Longest Premier in the Commonwealth of 26 years. And Sir Thomas Playford was, whilst Premier, was responsible for bringing a lot of manufacturing incentives here in South Australia. Okay, that completes the HA corridor. Next, we'll be entering the old Parliament and having a look at the old chamber. Okay, welcome to the old chamber. This is where it all began. So originally there was a council chamber built here on North Terrace in 1842, and then upon that it was further extended in the 1850s to incorporate two houses. So there was an amendment to the 1856 Constitution, so we had the lower house and the upper house situated in these quarters. What we're looking at now is the House of Assembly. So on this upper level, we had the lower house, and the upper house we had down below, so the other way around. There's a portrait to my left here by James Shaw. Right? Now this depicts what the chamber would have looked like in 1867. All right, so that would have been colonial ministers. And looking down the chamber, at the very back, is the original Speaker's chair for the House of Assembly. above the Speaker's chair would have been the media and Hansard reporting division box at the time. Okay, and since yes, we do have the Speaker's chair, the original Speaker's chair, we also have the upper house, the President's chair as well. So for the upper house, this was the original chair of the President. Okay. If we step back a bit and look up, we see the public gallery of the time. So this was the original gallery where the members of the public could come in and watch the proceedings of the very first parliamentary chamber. And of course we have our new chambers now as part of the new Parliament, so we don't use this chamber anymore as a functioning chamber for parliamentary proceedings. However, you will note at the moment it's set up for a committee hearing, okay, so the Parliament still utilises it for that. It's also fitted out with a lot of audio-visual equipment, okay, so we can do presentations and other sorts of seminars for community groups and such. In its time, it's also been a World War II enlistment office, as well as a dance hall in its time as well. And apart from that, it was also used as an administrative block for the train station that is situated next door to us here on North Terrace. And the final thing to point out is the restoration that has been done to this chamber since its first construction, and that is all the walnut and teak wood panelling that has all been restored to try and make the chamber look like what it would have looked like in its original inception. And lastly to point out, it's also used as a museum in the 1980s. Okay, that completes the tour of the old chamber, so what we'll do now is make our way to the new Parliament and the House of Assembly chamber. Okay, follow me and we'll take you into the House of Assembly chamber. Okay, so this is our functioning state Parliament chamber, the House of Assembly, the lower house. It's built in 1889 and it's inspired Victorian era decor. These are the benches for the members, all 47 members that are elected in 4-year terms. Okay, and I'd like to draw your attention to the carpet to begin with. Now we have a lawn area green colour in our carpet, and that's based off the House of Commons colour of green. Now, the meaning of the green parliament, or green floor of a parliament, comes from people meeting on the village green, the common people, to discuss their issues of the day. Okay, and that's what we've emulated. That's from the House of Commons. We have 2 South Australian twists in our carpet, and that is grapes and wheat. All right, they're the main agricultural products of South Australia. And also in the diamond pattern of the carpet is the golden wassail. It's the national floral emblem. And to the side of our carpet is the Sturt Desert Pea, which is an obscure red line throughout the chamber. And that's known as the bloodline or the sword line. And there's quite a history to why why that is in our carpet, and the House of Commons also has this design in their carpet as well. Now this is put in place so that members do not cross the line while in debate. Historically, members would wear swords into the chamber in the 1600s of Parliament, and debates would get so heated that sometimes blood would be spilt by the sword. Of course, nowadays we don't have weapons in Parliament, but we still keep this convention in place where members cannot cross over this line whilst they're speaking in debate. Okay. The benches are made from walnut and teak, some Southeast Asian imported woods. The local woods here at the time weren't up to the standard to build these benches, so we've used imported woods. And the seats are in a eucalypt green of a leather. Okay, and that eucalypt green is quite similar to the federal parliament in Canberra. Moving up from the benches are the columns. They're an Ionic style of column, a lot of classical Greek order of columns in our parliament. And at the very top, all the columns in this chamber are adorned by the angel of truth. And wherever she gazes down, the truth is encouraged to be told upon the members. Okay, so it's a very elaborate ceiling as well. Very intricate details. As I said earlier, all Victorian era inspired decor. Okay, now at this point of the tour, I'd like to point our attention to our mace, which sits upon the clerk's table. Okay, so this mace was gifted by the government in 1957 to the Parliament to commemorate 100 years of responsible government here in South Australia, starting from 1857, of course. It's gold plated, sterling silver, South Australian opals, and it's the authoritative symbol of our chamber. And adorned on the top is the South Australian coat of arms. And still in the design, there's wheat wrapped around the mace, accompanied by all the past speakers and our current speaker's signature on the mace itself. Okay, and the clerk's table here is of course where the clerk and deputy clerks sit, along with the Sergeant at Arms and other procedural office staff. And primarily they're employees of the House of Assembly, okay, and they're here to make sure the procedure and the function of the Parliament, in particular this chamber, functions correctly. They also assist the Speaker in doing that. Okay? And this is the Speaker's chair here. Okay, it's the highest point in the chamber. The Speaker is nominated by the members of the chamber to preside over the chamber and to maintain its order. And from this point, we could actually detail the chamber a bit better. On the right-hand side here are the government benches, and all along the front bench is where the South Australian Cabinet and the ministers sit, and behind that are the back benches of also the government. So currently it's the Liberal Party. And to the left of the chamber sits the opposition and the shadow cabinet and the front benches. And where the benches start to curve around is known as the cross bench, and that's where a lot of minor parties and independents will be sat. At the rear of the chamber is the Speaker's Gallery, and that's where invited staff and community groups and former members are welcome to sit and watch the proceedings of the Parliament. Moving on up above that is the Strangers Gallery. It's essentially a public gallery, so where people could come in and watch the proceedings of the Parliament. Okay, moving on from that, we can get a better angle of the boxes up above the Speaker's chair. Now directly above the Speaker's chair is the Hansard box. Okay, now the Hansard are the Parliamentary Reporting Division, so they record what is said in this chamber. And to the left and right of that Hansard box are reserved media boxes. So the media is free to come in and watch the proceedings. Okay, now that concludes our tour of the House of Assembly, so we'll follow me and we'll step out. To the left here, I'd like to point out the Premiers of South Australia placard. Okay, there's all the Premiers of South Australia. And our current Premier, Honourable Stephen Marshall. And I'd like to quickly point out on the right hand side is the Speaker's placard. Okay, so these are all the Speakers of the House of Assembly since 1857. And our current Speaker, Vincent Anthony Tarzio. Okay, moving on from that, we'll go to the Speaker's hallway. Okay, follow me and I'll show you what's details through the Speaker's hallway. To the right here, we actually have the portraits of all the past speakers. Okay, and behind us here we actually have some pictures that detail the history of the Parliament and how it came to be. This first picture we're looking at is the 1874 design by Edmund Wright and Lloyd Taylor. Okay, and they were paid £1,000 for their design by the government of the day. So the government decided to take that design and shorten it down to this version here to save money on the cost of it. Alright, and later on, when the 1889 structure came to be, we only had about a third of a parliament. There's financial constraints that we weren't actually able to build the full length of the parliament. So that was the House of Assembly chamber erected there, without the centre hall or the Legislative Council. Okay. Some more photos of the angles of what that looked like in 1889. And still another photo there in 1920. It wasn't until 1939 that it was actually completed. Okay, we got some all chamber photos here, 1928, where we actually had drapes installed into the chamber because the acoustics of the chamber were so poor. It's of course before the age of efficient microphones. This picture here depicts the centre hall being created, okay? So 1936, centre hall starting to be built. An interesting point here is Frank Walsh, okay, who was a stonemason on site, but later on became Premier of South Australia. Okay. Work for the Legislative Council, circa 1930, starting to commence. Centre hall's coming up here, along with the Legislative Council chamber. Here we have it nearing completion. Here in 1939, we have our upper house, the Legislative Council, which we'll see later on in the tour. Okay, June the 5th, 1939, there was a ceremony for the opening of the Parliament, the completed Parliament. Okay, it's another good aerial shot of it here. So the first opening of a completed Parliament. Okay. Follow me through here to the rear of the House of Assembly chamber. Okay, at the back of the chamber here, we have all the parliamentary papers and tabled reports that the members can reference. And to the left here, we have all the Hansard debates, so everything that was said in a particular year or volunteer, for the members to reference as well. And to the left of that, all the blue books here are the statutes, so all the laws of South Australia as well, that the members can utilise at the back of the chamber. Okay, I think that concludes the rear part of the chamber here.
Thank you so much, Will, for taking us through the House of Assembly. We'll move on to the next stop of our tour, which is the Parliamentary Research Library. Now we're at the Parliamentary Research Library, and I'd like to introduce you to Dr. John Westy, who's the Parliamentary Librarian, and I'll let John take you through the Research Library. Thank you.
Very much. No, thank you. Well, the library is this way. And this is the entrance to it, so we're between the House of Assembly and the Legislative Council. The library was founded in 1853, so it was the Legislative Council first, then the library and the House of Assembly later in 1857. So this is the entrance, and we're now between the two houses. And we're on 2 floors, so as you go through and see the library, imagine the same amount downstairs, the pretty bits up the top, the stuff filled with offices and machines and awful carpets downstairs. So anyway, the entrance, a couple of things worth having a look at. Firstly is our rare book collection. It's about 550 volumes or so. A lot of really very special items here. We have we've got the only copies known to be held in Australian libraries. We've got a collection of photographs of the Raj from the 1850s, a collection of 6 volumes on the Indian tribes of North America, again the only copy known to be held in Australian libraries, and a few other volumes like that too. I found our order form for 1854, which was the first year we purchased books, and many of those books we bought then are in fact now in here. The oldest book is our 1637 copy of the Bible. We've got a couple of books from the 1600s, but 1637 is the earliest. And probably the most valuable item is the small one lying on the table. It's having a rest. It's been open for too long, so it's having a rest to recover. That's a copy of Blackstone's account of crossing the Blue Mountains. He was the first European to do that. This particular edition only had 9 copies printed, so it's extremely rare and for that valuable. So this is the rare book vault, and looking after the books, of course, is one of the things the library does, but in fact, while these are beautiful and they have a great financial value and are extremely rare and interesting, the published paper materials, monographs, books, journals and so on, are now a very, very small part of our collection. We've got over 700,000 items in our holdings, and things made of paper accounts for about only 9%. Everything else is digital. So it's a library without books. The other satisfying thing is it's a library really without too many librarians. We've only got 1 librarian in the library, and even though I'm called the Parliamentary Librarian, that person is not me, so I am in fact the biggest fake in the building. We have a competent person who takes care of the library side of things, and she always grumbles at me because I'm not terribly competent at that sort of thing. So anyway, coming through here, we've got many other things that we have collected. We have a fabulous map. Any map which is bigger than your bed is inherently cool. This one dates 1939 and shows the counties of South Australia. Other states, for example, I think Victoria has shires, we've got counties, and within each county is the dotted line which marks the 100. These are architectural designs. Here on this wall, showing how the library used to be in the old Parliament House, which is towards the train station end of things. We moved around in that twice, and then we came over here just before World War II in 1939. These are the designs for moving the library around the old Parliament, and they date, I think, to about 1909. This sort of thing you may expect to see in a library. Things that you would not expect to see in a library, for example, are our double-barrel shotgun, which is above the entranceway there. This does mean overdue loans are a thing of the past. And the reason we have that is because it was given as a birthday present to Charles Cameron Kingston, who in the 1890s was the dominant South Australian politician, a leading figure behind Federation, and he loved guns. So that was given to him as a birthday present in 1904, I think, when he turned 54, and a descendant through his wife's side of the family his wife's sisters, many generations down, donated to the library about 2 years ago. So again, it's a nice thing to have, and given the connection of Kingston to this building, it's a fine thing for us to have. Coming through here, this is probably, I think, the most attractive, I'm going to say, room in the building. I'm biased, but certainly in the library. This is called the Muriel Matters room, named after Muriel Matters, who was a leading figure in votes for women in the United Kingdom, England, and is famous for chaining herself to the Grail in the House of Commons. But this room's been named after her. Oh, it's just a lovely, lovely room. Coming back this way, this is sort of our map collection room. And so you'll see these cabinets here on the wall, for example. These are our collection of maps. We've got a mixture. Those with the battens are the kind that you roll up. And then there are this cabinet, and ones which are flat, like that one, are kept here in this one. We're getting all of our maps, indeed the rare book collection generally, conserved and preserved and fixed up. So as we get maps and so on prepared, more and more of them are moving into here, so I'm having to get another map cabinet made to store things. This wonderful piece of medieval torture-looking device is in fact not that. It's a book press. So we're learning how to take care of some of the basic repairs ourselves. So if you have to fix up a paper from a document or a flat map or something like that, once you've done your work and it's wet and damp and needs to dry, put it in here, you turn that and you press it. I tell people that I'll do their fingers if they're particularly naughty in the library, but we don't really. So that sort of thing is what this is for. This actually was made in London and dates to about the mid-1800s. So it's, again, in the context library, a nice historical piece to have. Up there above the door is the sole surviving piece of carpet from the original completion of this part of the building in 1939. So that's what the library's first carpet looked like. Coming through this part of the library, you can see, for example, the reference desk, and the library has a number of different roles. I said there is only really one librarian, and so she's in charge of the library part of the library, called Library Services, obviously enough. In terms of staff numbers, the biggest section is the Research Services section, which takes care of research work for members of Parliament and their staff. We do all of the media monitoring for the Parliament, television, radio, newspapers, that kind of thing. Do a lot of interactive data set work, dashboards, that kind of thing. And also, as you can see in this, there's the community engagement aspect too. So there's sort of areas the library works in. I was asked what is it that I actually end up doing, and I just said I decorate, but that's fine for me. So coming through here, perhaps to wrap it up, these three things are really worth looking at. As I said, I found the 1854 order form for the library, and many of those books are now in the rare book vault. I also found on the order form these two globes. So these were purchased by the library in 1854. Came from England. This one to the right is the celestial one, and this to the left is the terrestrial. So this terrestrial one, as you can see here, this is, in terms of trying to understand it, think of it as Google Earth for 1854. That's what it is, that's what it does. You can see, if you look, you see Australia. There was no Australia as a nation. There were just the colonies, Western Australia, South Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, and Van Diemen's Land. There's no Queensland, there's no Northern Territory. A couple of things to look at. You can see there's the gap between South Australia and Western Australia. Our border didn't go west till the early 1860s. The other is because there's no Queensland, New South Wales border is much higher to the north than it is now. The other thing to have a look at, if Jesse can zoom in on where Adelaide is meant to be, if you can see it, what you will find is just a great big white hole, like a thermonuclear bomb has gone off. That is because since 1854, people have gone, this is where we are, this is where we are, this is where we are. And so all of those white holes is where people have tapped. And that has caused the damage there because their globes are made of paper mache. But they were bought as working tools. They weren't bought for me to ponce about with in 2020, so that's kind of fair enough. More annoying, however, is the big black gash to the north of Australia, in between us and New Guinea, and Malaysia, and Indonesia. It's not that the planet's gone on a diet and the equator has slipped a few inches down like a loose belt. Apparently in the early 1970s, a school child came through, spun the globes very quickly and used his metal ruler as a brake. That kind of damage there, and that's something we can't repair. The final thing to look at in terms of the terrestrial globe is the colour of the ocean, which in an ideal world would be blue. Here is the colour of the torrents. Not a good colour for an ocean. That's because since 1854 they've been left in the sun, and the ultraviolet light has in effect bleached it, and that's the colour it's ended up with. But they are still valuable items, and still, the question is, get me another one. That would be a very hard thing to do. So they're a very important part of the collection. The item in the middle is a really wonderful piece. It's a unique piece. This doesn't belong to the library, but we have it on long-term loan from the Astronomical Society of South Australia. And it's been a really nice cooperation between us both to have it here. This is called an orrery. It's a mechanical model of the solar system. You can see the sun in the middle, moon, earth, planets. Because it was made in 1864, there's no Pluto, of course, as it wasn't discovered. And these days there are a lot more moons which have been identified. But this is how the solar system appeared in 1864. 68, sorry, I got that completely wrong. It was made by David Adamson. He was a Scottish migrant to Adelaide. He built telescopes. He built musical instruments. He also built this orrery, and it's unique because it's the only one known to have been made anywhere in Australia in the 1800s, probably well into the 1900s. So it is a unique piece in that sense. You won't see another one like it from this period at all. It still works. You turn the little handle like a coffee grinder to the front, and that turns the gears underneath, which are hidden from view, which moves the spindle and the cogs, and everything rotates. Apparently the rotation, the orbits are accurate, but the distance from the sun is just representational. Otherwise you'd have Neptune out in North Adelaide, and that would make it a nightmare to turn. So we are lucky to have this, but when I totted up the value of that, and then thought about the damage done to that by busy schoolboys and metal rulers, I had the glass doors put in just so this sort of thing won't happen in the future. So we're all much happier for that. So that's the sort of sense of some of the items we've got in the library, the book collection, various artifacts and pieces. And perhaps when the building's open, you actually come in and see properly. We had, I think, last year nearly 10,000 people come through, so we're looking to bump that number next year now, so you can come in and see properly there.
So, a couple of the questions that have come through about the research library.
Yes.
The first one was from Tonya, who asked, what is the most obscure book in the collection?
The most obscure book is whatever one I found most recently. Every book in the library is obscure. It's a really weird, eclectic collection. Because there's only one Parliament library in each jurisdiction, we have collected all sorts of strange materials since the 1800s for all the different types of members of Parliament who have come through. We're also a legal deposit library, which means that anything published in South Australia, by law, a copy has to come here. So we get a whole range of weird material. One of the more fun ones I found recently was an old, the Australian Bureau of Statistics publishes census data, an older, much older 1800s equivalent of this published as a book. And what they would do is, so people wouldn't run off with the book, was they would have a thread of wire through the spine on a hook, so you could then put the book on a string and hang it, and you couldn't take it anywhere. So you'd have to stand and read the book there because there was a metal loop through the book locking it up to a chain or a piece of string in the shop or the library, so it couldn't go any further. That was fun.
And the next question we received was from Shane, and the question was, what will you do when you run out of space for all of the books here?
Yes, that's a fascinating question, and I ponder that one a lot. Particularly as we get every book published in this state, it's a difficult question. We don't have any off-site storage, and I don't really want to move into getting any. The way we get around it, I suppose, in a sense, is that we've got the State Library, of course, and the State Library has that broader role of providing services and looking after the collection for all of South Australia. Because we're a smaller library and focused directly on members of Parliament, their staff, we don't have that broader obligation to keep everything. And so, for example, the newspapers, the paper copies of the newspapers, we get a copy and we clip for our media monitoring and keep a digital version of relevant articles. But the paper copy itself we only keep for 3 to 5 years, depending on the publication. By which point, the paper used these days is not as good as the older paper. The inks are soy-based, so after 3 to 5 years they're starting to break down and turn to dust in any case, which isn't something we want in the library. We do have, for example, the Advertiser going back to the first edition, and the paper quality is different. They're actually in very good condition. They're probably better nicked than a copy of a paper that's 5 years old now. So we do have a certain degree of weeding and so on to keep space open, and as I said, increasingly, while we still buy books, we always will as far as I'm concerned, the collection is moving more and more towards digital. That brings different space issues as we have to find and pay for servers and cloud storage and that kind of thing, but it's not the same physical space as a bookcase. So it's just manageable, and I think it will probably stay just manageable, but we have to be very careful. We can't waste space, as there's always a lot of pressure to put more books and magazines, documents and so forth somewhere.
Okay, well thank you very much for your time taking us through the library. It's a wonderful place to be able to see, and we'll move on to the next part of our tour. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you very much. Ta.
Okay, so we are now rejoined by Will, who will be taking us through the Legislative Council. But before we get started, I'll just answer some of the public questions that we have received. So the first question came through from Lauren, and Lauren asked whether or not the Speaker was here all of the time. And the response to that question is that he is here a lot of the time, but he is also the representative for the electorate of Hartley. So he spends a lot of time in the electorate as well, working for his constituents. So there would be a balance between his obligations as the Speaker of the House of Assembly and his obligations as the member who represents the constituents in Hartley. The next question we received was from John, and John asked whether there were any rules on members' attire. So in respect of the House of Assembly, there are no specific rules apart from Speaker rulings over the years, and a couple of things have emerged from those Speaker rulings. The first is that there are no hats permitted in the chamber. You can't wear anything that would bring the House into disrepute. You shouldn't wear items or objects that convey a particular message. And otherwise, smart casual attire for members of the public who are coming to visit the building is appropriate. So I think those take care of the questions that we've received, and I'll now hand over to Will, who will take us through the Legislative Council. Thank you, Will.
Thanks very much, Charlie. Okay, now we've seen the Speaker's hallway, now we're going to see the President's hallway. Okay, so we'll take you down, we'll have a look what's detailed through here. Now primarily there's portraits of the past presidents. So it's convention that once the President has finished their term, they'll commission a portrait and then donate it to the Legislative Council, where they'll be displayed here. Now, as we move down and detail some of the portraits for you, one we have on our left here is the Honourable Lieber. She was President in 1986 to 1989. She's one of the first upper house presiding officers in the Commonwealth, the first female one. Okay. Now the ones on my left here are much more modern, but the ones on the right being a lot more historical. This one here at Baker is in 1893. Okay, and you can see how much of the attire and the portrait style has changed. Another notable President portrait here is the Honourable Ron Roberts, who was President in 2002. And now, of course, it's their portrait, so they can decide how they like to have it painted. And Ron Roberts here has had his eyes put into the portrait because he used to be an electrician. Okay, so it's showing his origins there. And in addition, he also has the South Australian flag painted onto the table there as well. When he was President, and during that time there was talk about changing the South Australian flag, and he was an advocate for keeping it as it was. That's why he's wanting to have that painted into his portrait there. Okay, moving along. On the right here, we have Sir James Hurdle Fisher, President 1857. Okay, so the first President of the Legislative Council. You can see how huge this portrait is. Okay, very bold, very intricate design with the frame, and he would have been a very wealthy man to have that commissioned. And I like to contrast that with the one on the right here, one of our most recent portraits, the Honourable John Gazzola, President from 2012 to 2014. Okay, much more modest frame, much more casual design. And something I like to note in this portrait is that John Gazzola had the Italian colours painted into his tie. Okay. And that was important because he was one of the first non-Anglo-Saxon presidents for the Legislative Council. Alright, so we wanted to demonstrate his heritage there. Alright, moving along from that, that would conclude the President's hallway, so we'll make our way to the front of the Legislative Council chamber. Detail here is a portrait of Her Majesty the Queen in her study room. Okay, so this portrait was housed in Government House. Now the Legislative Council was quite lucky to have it and be able to display it here. Okay, and in context with that, we have signed portraits of the royals. So the first one here is from Prince Philip in 1954. When they did their royal tour of Australia, and they were actually present here to open, to be part of the opening ceremony of the Parliament. And to the left of that, we have Her Majesty the Queen, okay, in her 1954 picture and signature. Okay, and behind us here there's another portrait I'd like to touch on. The Honourable Sir John Langdon Bonython, who was proprietor of the Advertiser at the time. Very wealthy man, he was a media mogul of South Australia at that time. And as a young boy he would remember the Parliament when it was built in the 1930s. He was so dismayed when driving past the Parliament that it still hadn't been completed that he went ahead and donated £100,000 of his own money and gifted that to the state to help with the completion of the Parliament. Okay, so we have that plaque to remember that. Alright, that concludes the front of the Legislative Council chamber. So what we'll do now is actually go inside and have a look at the upper house. Okay, completed in 1939. It's more of a simplistic design. It's not Victorian era inspired decor like the House of Assembly. Okay, it was built to more of a budget. Okay, we'll start with the carpet. Now there's a lot of red throughout the chamber. Then the carpet design is the Sturt Desert Pea. Right, that's our state floral emblem. Now you may be wondering why the colour red is selected. Now the colour red comes from the tradition of the Westminster system again, and the Parliament in England, and that is the colour of the House of Lords is also red. Okay, so that's emulated here as well. And why red in particular? Well, the history going back with the colour red is the colour of blood, but to be in the House of Lords you have to be part of the royal bloodline. Okay, so it's red. And the benches are also that colour as well. 22 members here in the Legislative Council that are elected on 8-year terms. No final benches here. And the wood here is all Queensland maple. Okay, so an imported wood again for the construction of the chamber. And that wood in particular is used because it has that property of being able to bow. And we can see here underneath the mezzanine level that it's bowed, so that it's able to reflect sound. Okay, so learning from the lessons of the previous chamber, the House of Assembly chamber, for its poor acoustics, it was designed so that when one would speak, be able to be heard at a quite appropriate level without shouting. All right, while we're on the floor, I'll explain the layout of this chamber. It's quite similar to the House of Assembly chamber. In front of us here are the government benches, okay, on the right hand side of the chamber again. And on the left hand side, we have the opposition benches. And where the benches curve is known as the crossbench, and that's where minor parties and independents have their seats. And from this angle here, we can see the President's Gallery. It's quite similar to the Speaker's Gallery, so it's invited guests, community groups and staff of members can utilise that gallery. Up above that is the Public Gallery, formerly known as the Strangers Gallery. That's where members of the public can come in and watch the proceedings of the Parliament. However, there is a notable difference from that level, and that is the mezzanine level that is adorning this chamber. Now that's installed to hold extra capacity for when people view the opening of the Parliament, because that happens in this chamber, not the lower house. It happens in the upper house. Okay, up on that same level, we have the Hansard box again above the President's chair that record that do the recording of the proceedings of the Parliament. And to the left and right are the media boxes again. Okay. Now, draw your attention to the clerk's table for the Legislative Council and their symbol of authority, which is the black rod. Okay, so it's a sterling silver tip with the piping shrike as a South Australian animal embossed on the top. And it's made of ebonite. Okay, so it's a real authoritative symbol of the monarchy. Traditionally, the usher of the black rod would carry this and announce the presence of the monarch as they were coming through. Okay, on the clerk's table here, we have the clerk and the deputy clerk, just like the House of Assembly. And moving on from up that is the President's chair. Okay, so this is the presiding officer of the upper house will sit. Okay. Now this chair has quite intricate design that has an affinity with the monarchy, and then of course it's the UK coat of arms on top. Okay, and this chair was actually made in 1954 for Her Majesty the Queen when she did her royal tour, and she sat in this chair and opened up the Parliament in the ceremony that we had at that time. What I'll touch on next are the columns. At the base of our columns is the meander, which is a Greek pattern, okay? Now all the Greek classical order of columns we have in the Parliament are all nods to Greece, which is seen as a birthplace of democracy, the golden age of Pericles. That's why those little details are put in. And in particular, we have Corinthian columns. Okay, that concludes the tour of the Legislative Council chamber. If you follow me, we'll step out. Okay, come through and come back to where we started in Centre Hall. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Will, for taking us through today. We hope that you enjoyed your experience and makes up for the fact that our building has been temporarily closed. We look forward to having you back in here in person when the building reopens. And we would also like to say that you can always access your Parliament through watching the live streams that are available on the Parliament's website or through accessing Hansard. So we look forward to seeing you again in the future, and thank you very much, Will, for your time today. Thank you.